Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Robert Redfield, who has had a distinguished career in service to the United States. Most recently, Dr. Redfield was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, from 2018 to 2021. He also served in the Army Medical Service as a physician and medical researcher before retiring as a colonel in 1996. Dr. Redfield is currently the senior medical advisor to AM LLC. AM empowers leaders and communities with innovative solutions and insights to deliver mission-critical services to address a variety of global and local public health challenges. Dr. Robert Redfield, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John, thanks a lot for having me. Look forward to our conversation.
Likewise. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Dr. Redfield, will cover management challenges related to biological diseases, complex systems, and technology. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your general assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, an assessment of the major challenges facing the global order?
You know, John, I think it's a really important question, and one of the reasons I look forward to our dialogue. I'm someone who's been very interested my entire career about national security issues for the United States. And one of the debates that I'm trying to help facilitate is a growing recognition that the national security of the United States is actually more likely to be impacted by biosecurity than it is by our traditional security of worrying about Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The way of life of Americans is likely to change because of the biosecurity consequences much more than our traditional defense. And unfortunately, and I led CDC for 3 years, and one of the key observations I made how really tragically underfunded and undersupported our public health agencies have been in this nation for decades. And that the data management structure, the laboratory resilience, the public health workforce, the global distribution of our capacity has really never really been developed. And as I say that to many people, that COVID kind of woke people up because it really did impact our way of life. A lot of it, I think, was unfortunately unnecessary. I was not an advocate for locking down. I didn't think that was a rational public health approach to this, and really had enormous consequences both for K through 12 as well as obviously our economy, and really didn't impact the pandemic as much as our efforts to build the capacity to develop biological countermeasures in diagnostics, in antivirals, and in vaccines, and to have the capacity to deliver that in a highly effective way. So when you look at it today, I tell people that the COVID pandemic was really the lesser pandemic, that our nation's very vulnerable. And when I became CDC director, one of the reasons I took the job, having 12 living grandchildren, that I do think our nation's very vulnerable to a bird flu pandemic, which, unlike COVID, which has maybe 0.5% mortality or less, the bird flu pandemic, when it occurs, will probably have a mortality rate between 5 and 50%. It would be much different. And our nation's not prepared. And we need to look at building the private-public partnerships that are required. I was listening today about the debate about whether our arms supplies are down, with Raytheon and others, because of all the arms we've given to Ukraine, and it will take 5 years to replace this and 3 years to replace that. We need to build the same type of production capability with private-public partnerships for diagnostics, for vaccines, for antivirals, so that we have these long-term private-public partnerships and approach it with the same vigilance that we approach our traditional defense security. So to me, that's the big issue. That's the big elephant in the room. And we have, we're nowhere near to building that relationship between the private sector and our effort to have a national security defense against public health threats. But they are our greatest threat. And Congressman Tom Cole always would say the Americans are much more likely to be affected by our public health threats than we are from our traditional security threats that we look at in Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. And I just want to underscore that because I do think that is the threat for our nation for the future.
Mm. Yeah, well, you are hitting right on one of the major themes of this podcast is bringing like new tech into the government space. And China is famous, or perhaps infamous, for like military civil fusion, and I certainly would not advocate for mimicking China extensively along those lines. But I do think that we can maybe take a page from the way China has integrated some of their private efforts and government efforts, and it sounds like you would probably agree with that. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, John, I would say, listen, we do that in terms of our traditional defense.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Army, I served for over 20 years. You were in the Marines. The U.S. Army doesn't make the airplanes. We don't make the missiles. All right. We don't actually make the ammunition.
Right.
We train the men and women how to use those products to defend our nation. The same has to be true for our defense strategy for biological national security. Is that we need to have a private-public partnership with the private sector, so that we're making the vaccines that we need, we're making the antivirals we need, we're making the diagnostics we need. We're building private sector capacity like AMLLC that I work with, where their job is to provide government contracts to augment the public health capacity that we don't have intrinsic to our public sector. One thing I respected a lot about the Trump administration and the time that I was there was a great deal of respect for the private sector. When President Trump wanted to have a vaccine by 2021, there were people in the room that suggested the way we'd get that is by giving the $17 billion to NIH, and the public sector would go ahead and develop the vaccine. And Ambassador Birx and I both have been in the military. She had been my deputy for years. We both tried to acknowledge that the NIH had never really developed any vaccine. The private sector develops vaccines.
Right.
And that we needed to engage the private sector. And the public sector had a role. We could finance it. We took advantage of the Defense Department's ability to distribute, and they did such an excellent job in their ability to do logistics, and the Defense Production Act. But it was ultimately the private sector that within 8 months delivered 3 FDA-approved vaccines for the American public. And again, that has to be codified in a way that has a long-term vision, not a short-term vision. Science has actually developed some really remarkable new technology. When I was CDC director, I used to, stay up at night worried about bird flu pandemic, which I think is the great threat that we have. And I realized when the bird flu pandemic came, we would recognize it. And then it would take us probably 6, 12, 18 months before we develop a vaccine. And so for the first 6 to 12 months, 18 months, what we'd really do is be doing a body count. All right. And so the science of the mRNA technology now allows me to develop a vaccine in 2 to 4 weeks. But now that I have a vaccine in 2 to 4 weeks, this nation has no capacity to produce that vaccine. So we could produce the vaccine for maybe 100,000 people of our 330 million people. But the only way we're going to have that capacity to produce that vaccine, if we ever need it, is to build a private sector, public sector partnership that builds that capacity that we can allow to do other things when we don't need it. Just like you could argue that some of the Defense Department technology could be used to build domestic airplanes or domestic this or domestic that if they don't need it. But if we need it, we can prioritize that manufacturing capability to meet the manufacturing needs that we need to have an appropriate biosecurity thing. I will say, and I think that's really important, as opposed to maybe dual use. Well, we're looking at how to engage the private sector to meet a long-term national security goal. And the problem we have in 2022 is no one sees biosecurity as a priority.
Is that right? That's something that you think is not causing people to sit up in their chairs?
Yeah, it depends on how you define priority.
Mm-hmm.
It is true that they consider it a priority if they want to give verbiage to it.
Mm.
It isn't true if you want to say a priority is that they're funding and building the infrastructure and building the structure to actually execute the mission. When I was CDC director, CDC, which funds the public health infrastructure in the entire United States, we had a budget that year of $5 to $6 billion for the entire United States public health infrastructure. And we don't have a systematic public health data system in the United States.
Mm.
You can't have a public health response agency if you don't have real-time data. I give the story about my first briefing as CDC director. I went down there in late March, and I had a briefing in the first week of April. And the first epidemic that I was asked to lead a public health response to was opioid-related deaths. And sadly, we had 80,000 people die the year before I became CDC director. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of people. I mean, even the entire Vietnam conflict, we only had 53 to 57,000 people between the 50s and 70s. I had 80,000 young people, mostly under the age of 45, in 1 year. And people know I've said this publicly before. I almost lost one of my 6 children who had cocaine that got contaminated with fentanyl.
Is that right?
If it wasn't for the rescue squads and Narcan, and he would no longer be with us. So this was personal. Trump had put a lot of money into it. So I got briefed on it. And when I got my briefing over, it was an excellent briefing. I mean, really excellent briefing. And when I got the briefing over, I asked the lead briefers what the data was through that I was about to make my recommendations on. And they said the data was through March 2015. And I said, but it's April 2018. And they said, Director, you don't understand the complexity of getting the data from the states, getting it curated, make sure it's accurate. And I said, no, what I didn't understand is I thought I was coming down here to lead a public health response, and you're telling me what I'm really going to be as a medical historian. In other words, if we're going to have a response agency, you've got to have real-time data. And you saw this in COVID, where we didn't have real-time data. You saw it more recently with monkeypox. We don't have real-time data. Until the public health system has real-time data, you would not go to war based on intelligence that was 3 years out of date. You have to have real-time data if you're going to have a real-time response. And of course, we don't have that.
I see.
And even though I was able to get the Defense Modernization, Data Modernization Act into Congress, and they invested and made some headway, I made the case, but Congress gave me the first year, I think, $350 million to rebuild the public health data system for the entire United States. My hospital system in Baltimore spent $1 billion. Non-proportional investment. I got misunderstood a couple times because on Congress, I would tell them what I'm looking for is 3 to 5 aircraft carriers. And they would say, what does the CDC need with aircraft carriers? I said, no, I don't need aircraft carriers. I need the budget of 3 to 5 aircraft carriers. And that needs to be invested in public health. So our investment in public health is woefully inadequate. And our current structure for how we're going to maximize our ability to respond to global health security is woefully inadequate. And when I tell you, I don't think the Congress and other leaders in our nation, other than giving a conversation to it, have converted that into definitive action that's going to put us on a path so that we are not going to be here 3 to 5 years from now with a bird flu pandemic with a mortality rate of 5% and not have the ability to respond in an effective way.
You've very strongly made the point that you think that our public health is underfunded, but how else would you characterize the public health institution currently, or could you compare the institution like pre-COVID to now? What would be your assessment of that as an institution?
Well, when I was asked to be the CDC director, I was very, very honored. I trained my whole life in infectious disease and virology. I obviously was very in the middle of the military, focused on protecting sailors, soldiers and airmen, from viral threats around the world. I think I understood the space as anybody. And I was really shocked to find the amount of investment that our nation had made in public health. When you look at it, public health has been underinvested. And when I tell you public health, of my CDC budget, probably 75% of that went out to the states, local, tribal, territorial health departments, and funds their public health budget. So whatever state you're from, CDC is probably funding 70% of your public health budget. All right. So it is the public health system of the nation. And we're spending, and when I went in, it was about 5 billion. We got up to 8 billion. The point is it's highly underinvested in. And what happened to CDC, and it's an agency I have great respect for, and they're wonderful public health people. But what happened to them sometime from when they started in the 40s, when they came into existence, and they were part of the Defense Department, and their job was to help figure out how to protect soldiers, sailors, and airmen from malaria. That's why they went to Atlanta, because we had a malaria in Atlanta. We didn't have malaria in Washington. And then it emerged into, a Center for Disease Control. And then before you know it, focusing on infectious disease, and then eventually Centers of Disease Control, focusing on multiple different things. What happened to the agency is that it was so chronically underfunded. And I don't know if you've been in organizations where you've been chronically not given the resources you need to do your mission.
Hey, I spent 20 years in the Marines. We were constantly being asked to do things with little. Yeah.
So when you end up with a mission, and everyone tells you your mission's really important, but at the end of the day, you don't get the resources for your mission, I think it wears on the group. And when I became CDC director, when I looked at, probably 10, 15,000 people we had that were direct employees, and then we had contractors on top of it, and asked how many had been there 10 years or more, almost the whole room stood up, and many of them 20 years, and some of them 30 years. These people had worked their heart out to protect the public health of our nation with inadequate resources. And so what eventually happened is they drifted into an organization that, in my view, became more academic. It didn't become a public health response agency. It became more of an academic institution that wrote papers and did epidemiological studies about public health that were usually 3 to 5 years out of date. Like my opioid talk that I gave you, saying the data was from 2015 and I was trying to launch a response in 2018. Good people trying to do the best they can do, chronically underfunded, chronically understaffed, chronically with a non-optimal structure. And the new director has sort of said that in her recent review, saying we need to get CDC back to the primary mission of being a public health response agency. But you need more than words.
I see.
And
Yeah.
you need more than words.
Yeah.
And the way CDC is funded is not appropriate. Congress funds CDC by hundreds of different what we call PPAs. And so some congressman wants a program on, this, and they fund it. Someone in this. So myself as a director of CDC, I had no revenue that I could invest in priorities. I only could invest in the different areas that Congress funded in a very piecemeal way. It's not the right way to fund the agency. So it really needs an enormous overhaul. And I hope our public health response capability gets totally overhauled. Now, I happen to believe that if we're going to look at this with the biosecurity, national security perspective that I have for it, meaning that this is probably the greatest national security threat our nation has, more so than China or Russia or North Korea or Iran. You got to figure out where you house this. I'm a big advocate that probably our biosecurity defense needs to be housed within the Defense Department. All right, and we need to take advantage of how our Defense Department has built a traditional security um, um, perspective and mirror that
Where
for
where
biosecurity.
where does our biosecurity nucleus reside now?
Sadly, at NIH, which I don't think
Okay.
it belongs. When I was
Okay.
in the military, it was still at Fort Detrick in the U.S. Army, and we had the lead. But somewhere in the last 10 or 15 years, they dismantled that and put the lead into NIH, which I don't think is the place for it to be. You know, it's not our biosecurity organization. It's a great research institution. I have great respect for it. My mom and dad were there. My mom and dad spent many years at NIH. My dad died young in the 50s. My mom stayed with it for many years of her life. It's a great organization, but its mission is to do science.
Mm.
It's not to do biosecurity. And we need, Fort Detrick used to be the mothership for our biosecurity, but it all got moved to NIH.
About what time frame was that, would
I'm
you
going to
say?
say, it was probably, I'm getting old now. It was probably 20 years ago.
Is that right? Huh. Is this something that you either proposed or talked about when you were with the CDC, or is this something that you're reflecting on now and you would make as a recommendation?
Yeah, I think a lot of when I went to CDC, I was very worried about a global pandemic, bird flu pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
But I went there thinking that all the pieces were in place. This was the premier public health institution, not in the United States, but the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
So I assumed all the pieces were in place. And what I rapidly found out is the pieces weren't in place.
Hmm.
And so now I got a little distracted. I had this thing called the COVID pandemic,
Yeah.
while I was there. And all that did is just underscore how underprepared we were for the pandemic. I mean,
Right.
and even CDC, if you look at CDC, which funds all the state and territorial and local health departments, when I wanted to go into a certain state to try to respond to the COVID pandemic, my CDC folks told me that I couldn't go in because I wasn't invited. And I would say, what do you mean I'm not invited? I'm funding their, 75% of their public health system. Well, Bob, we have to be invited. Or when I couldn't get the data I needed out of the states, and I say, we need to get the data. Well, we need to ask them for the data. So the whole structure it's not structured like you and I are used to, you and the Marines and me in the military. When I needed people to help me with the 3 Ebola outbreaks that I fought in Africa, in the DRC, and I didn't have people, even though we had a lot of people at CDC, I was told I had to ask for volunteers. How do I respond to a public health crisis when I have, 12,000, 15,000 employees, and I say, but, any of you want to volunteer to go to the DRC with me? No, you have to have a response team. I was more used to the military where I could just say, call up 300 people and let's go.
Mm.
So the whole
Uh,
structure is not
yeah,
the whole structure is not built for response.
right. Are there Department of Defense personnel embedded or detailed over to that? I'm sorry, what you called it, the biosecurity capability?
There really should. I mean, if I look at what happened with the second largest Ebola outbreak in the history of the world, we could have shut it down and made it one of the smallest ones. But it was in the DRC and it was concentrated in a single city off the coast of Uganda. The Army, my old group at Walter Reed, had a good lab right on the border in Uganda in Fort Poldo. I wanted to put a team in to go in and help shut down this Ebola outbreak when we were still dealing with less than 100 people, right?
Mm, hmm.
And and my mistake was I asked for permission
Mm.
because
Yeah.
the military was willing to help me and we were willing to do it together, but I asked for permission and the State Department basically said I couldn't put U.S. people in there because it was too dangerous because it was a war zone.
Mm.
And I said, well, I don't know if it's more dangerous than us going in to take care of Ebola. Ebola is pretty dangerous. And we got delayed by weeks because of the State Department. So I had proposed, and if I had gotten a second term, I would have pushed for this. We need a joint command where we had, like 250 experts in from CDC and 250 experts in the military, and that we did a rapid deployment group that could go into these epidemic settings where the military understood the security issues and could make sure they taught us not to be stupid about security, and we could teach them a little bit about the pathogens that were going afterwards so they weren't stupid. I mean, when the Ebola outbreak happened in 2014, it's common knowledge that the military helped CDC go into the Ebola outbreak. But the military refused to allow CDC to get back on the helicopters after they were in the Ebola zone.
Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that shows you a total disconnect.
Hmm.
And what we needed was we still need an integrated unit of 500 to 1,000 people that could deploy on a dime. It doesn't help me to go in to fight most of our pandemics that we're having, a lot of the pandemics we're having right now are not occurring in stable environments. Whether it was the stuff in Yemen, whether it was the stuff in the Eastern DRC, you should anticipate that we're going to have epidemic threats in areas that are geopolitically not very stable. But the problem with the geopolitical instability, it may not be able to go very far. But the pandemic that's there could go global.
Mm.
And we need teams to be able to go in and shut it down. I could have shut down the Ebola outbreak probably within less than 100, 200 cases if we had been given if we had been cleared to do our job.
Mm. Right. Wow.
And we weren't. And I mean, I'm not blaming these people were well-meaning, but it goes back to the lack of structure to meet the mission.
Mm.
You need
Yeah.
you need the proportional budget to meet the mission, but you also need the structure, and then you need the private public partnerships to be able to provide the tools when and if we need them. When I was in the Ebola outbreak in DRC, NIH, and did some great work there. We helped along with them. But when we started that Ebola outbreak in the Eastern DRC, there was no therapy, and it was 70 to 90% mortality. And within a year and a half, we had monoclonal antibodies that could save people's lives, and the mortality was less than, say, 10%.
Mm.
And NIH proved it in a war zone.
Mm.
And
Right.
we didn't have a vaccine, but we had a vaccine by Merck that they had looked at in the previous epidemic, 2014 thing, and we deployed that vaccine, and lo and behold, we found out the vaccine worked.
Mm.
So those tools were developed fighting the pandemic. So I'm going to give a lot of credit to NIH. They really helped lead that work. Cliff Lane and others,
Yeah.
and some folks at CDC helped, and some folks at WHO helped. My point being that you have to build structure to accomplish those missions. They shouldn't be accidental.
I see. I see. Um, so, coming out of COVID now, what suggestions would you have for what we can do in the cognitive domain to better prepare populations for the next pandemic?
Help me expand a little bit for me, John, how you're using the word cognitive domain.
Yeah, well, ultimately, the information that people consume, whether it's daily news, whether it's news about what's happening in the Ukraine, or it's related to COVID or a future pandemic, people consume information from a variety of different sources, and it affects their decision making. And I think a lot of people would assert that the information which was streaming at the global commons, but maybe let's just stick to the United States. The information that was being delivered to people was coming through a variety of different channels, and people were assessing the information differently, and it caused a lot of strife within our society. So, through that kind of a lens, how would you, as a person who has spent a lot of time thinking and grappling with this kind of a problem, think that we could better prepare for a future pandemic where there's likely going to be confusion and maybe false information, misinformation, disinformation, and all that kind of stuff. How would you think that we could prepare better for the next pandemic as a society?
Yeah, I think it's a critical question. I hate to say this, but I do think a lot of damage was done
Hmm.
when you talk about preparing for the next one. Um, and, maybe a lot of different reasons. I was extremely uh, unhappy with how things evolved. I mean, I thought as CDC director for the premier public health agency in the world, I should have the opportunity to speak to the American public, if not on a twice a day basis, a daily basis, and communicate effectively about the issues.
Hmm.
And I was not allowed to do that.
Hmm. I did not know that.
And different people, tried to emerge on television to communicate to people, Fauci being one, for example. Um, the Secretary of Health felt that he probably should be more of a spokesman than the CDC director. Um, then we had the White House coordinator, but I was directly restricted from communicating. And my request to present to the American public were almost universally denied
Hmm.
uh, by the Department of Health and Human Service. Now they'll say it was under direction above them. I don't know that because I only know the people that denied me, and they were based at HHS.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think the American public needed to have a daily dialogue with the CDC director and the experts at CDC and the experts in health department. And I think, unfortunately, that didn't happen. And what you saw is a couple things. One thing, I think you saw some of the information get politicized. But I also think you saw some of the information, my style, if you asked me a question and I didn't know the answer, I would tell you, I don't know the answer.
Hmm.
There were other colleagues that were front and center on this that weren't at CDC. They would tell you an answer that, even if they didn't think it was the right answer, they'd tell you the answer to get you to conclude what they wanted you to conclude because they decided they knew what you needed to conclude.
Mm.
Right? They decided the narrative. If anything happened that was really sad about the communication, there was certain people that decided what narrative had to be acceptable. And then that's it. I give the example, the narrative about herd immunity. Well, there was, I would argue there was no reason to believe there would ever be herd immunity to this pathogen. And yet there were other people that said there would be herd immunity, and they said, when we get to 30% of people infected or vaccinated, this pandemic will go away.
Mm.
And then later, I remember Fauci said it was 50%. And then about a month or two later, he said 70%.
Mm.
And the reporter asked him, Dr. Fauci, what changed? Because, you recently said it was 50%, and now you say it's 70%. And Tony said, well, I told you 50% because I didn't think you were ready to hear 70%.
Mm.
No, I would tell you what I told you. I told people 95% or more. I didn't think there was going to be herd immunity. So I think when you try to, you just got to tell the truth.
Right.
And the answer is, I don't know. This is what I think. This is the best we can do. The same thing you've seen with vaccines. The argument was once we got the vaccines, this was going to be over. Well, I didn't feel that way. I love the vaccines. They're important, but they made an impact, but they're not bulletproof. If natural immunity only lasted around 4 to 6 months, the vaccines aren't going to last longer. And so when people are told that the vaccines are going to, you're fully vaccinated, whatever that means, I didn't like the term. And then all of a sudden, after 6 or 8 months, you're getting infected again. Oh, well, now you need a booster, and now you're protected. And no, 4 months later, you're getting infected again.
Mm-hmm.
And people say that this is an epidemic of the unvaccinated. Only to now have to say the majority of people that are dying of COVID, and we're losing 300 to 400 people a day now, even though people think it's over, 340 people a day is a lot of people that are dying of COVID. And guess
Mm-hmm.
what? A majority of the people that die today are vaccinated and
Mm.
boosted.
Right.
So once you lose credibility with the American public, then you open up the door for the polarization, the politics, people wondering,
Yeah.
public health view, or is your view tainted by your politics?
Right.
So I think we've lost an enormous amount of credibility.
Yeah. Well, this circles back to my question a moment ago about the public health institution or other institutions which undergird society. Our society is built upon thousands of years of common law and hard fought, hard won issues that have brought us to where we are right now. My point is that it's really hard to build. Building is hard, but tearing down is surprisingly easy. And I think you're spot on right there, saying it is so easy to lose trust.
On your analogy, building is hard, tearing down is easy, and rebuilding is even harder. And that's one of the things rebuilding is so hard. And because once these institutions have lost credibility, I mean, the other example that's very personal to me, I'm a virologist. I spent, over 35 years, 40 years learning virology. It's in a way, it's interesting. I got to be the CDC director at a time they hadn't had another virologist as a CDC director.
Oh, is
At a
that right?
time we had a pretty significant virus affect our world, and I've looked at this very carefully. And in January of 2020, I called Fauci and I called Jeremy Farrar and I called Tedros, head of WHO, and I told him I really thought it was important that we scientifically evaluate the origins of this virus. Did it come from evolution, like historically a virus had come from, or did it come from a laboratory?
Mm-hmm.
Was it a consequence of science or a consequence of nature? And I did my own analysis, and I told them my hypothesis is that it came from a laboratory. And
Mm-hmm.
I went on CNN, and I know people were shocked when I said that. I immediately, and I suggested we get together and develop scientific teams to evaluate the science on this. And sadly, I found out afterwards for Freedom of Information, and that was in mid-January, that Fauci and Collins and Farrar had started secret meetings with other virologists, and they basically concluded it had to come from nature. And when I kind of asked after the fact why I wasn't included, I was told by some of the members that were there that I wasn't included because I had the wrong narrative. They'd already decided the narrative. It came from nature.
Mm.
And, I can tell you, obviously, I've gotten death threats and I got ostracized. I was called a conspirator, all because I just tried to put a scientific hypothesis out there that, in my scientific opinion, it's this virus evolved from the laboratory. And we have lots of evidence to support that. But I respect their scientific opinion that it came from nature.
Mm-hmm.
Show me what scientific evidence you have, much of it which has been contrived. For example, they talk about the wet market. Well, the wet market was the outbreak in December 31st and the first week in January, this last, week of December. But we now know that the pandemic started in Wuhan way back in September.
Right.
So it had nothing to do with the wet market. And the big science papers that they quote as being proof of it, if you look at those science papers, first they say it has nothing to do with origin. Those science papers went in and looked for the virus in the animals in the wet market, and they looked for in the environment, like on the floor and different places. They didn't find it in any animal, but they found it in the environment. But they didn't look at the train station.
Mm.
They didn't look at the bus station. This virus was all through Wuhan there. It had nothing to do with origin. So the fact it goes back to losing credibility, where they've dug their heels in to say, and particularly for NIH to do this, which is very antithetical to science, because science should just keep an open mind and go after it. And particularly with NIH, because they funded the research that potentially led to this pandemic. They should be even more aggressive about being open-minded. So it's very disheartening to me. And so when you ask about the communication, I do think there's been enormous credibility lost. That, rebuilding that credibility is really going to be hard.
Well, what would you suggest along those lines, Dr. Redfield?
Well, what I'd like to see is a real honest, open scientific evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to me when WHO decided to do a scientific evaluation. I had nominated over 20 people to be on the committee. Only one was accepted, and he happened to be Chinese. And all of the committee had to be approved by China. And that group then concluded that there was not evidence, that the first group concluded there was not evidence from the laboratory came from evolution. But who did the head of WHO put in charge of the WHO group that went to China to evaluate this question? They put the guy in charge of EcoHealth Alliance who was doing the research. So then Lancet, later, Lancet decides to form a commission.
I'm sorry, Lancet. I think that's the first time I've heard you say that.
Lancet's a medical journal.
Okay.
In
Okay.
Europe, a big one.
Thank you. Okay.
And they decided to put a commission together to evaluate the origin of the virus and to look at the pandemic and how it happened. And Jeff Sachs, who used to be at Columbia, really a reputable epidemiologist, great career, he was put in charge. And so he was then asked a subgroup to do origin. And the guy that was recommended to him was Peter Dusek, again, the head of EcoHealth Alliance. And he became the head guy to evaluate what the origin was. He didn't declare a conflict. I mean, he was the guy NIH was funding to do the work. And once Jeff finally realized that, he finally canceled the commission, and he was very angry because he felt he had been used how would you have the guy who's in the middle of the game put in charge of evaluating the game? So there's a total loss of credibility. Science is so beautiful because science purifies itself. I have a lot of confidence in science,
Mm.
but science doesn't purify itself when you rig the game.
Mm.
And they rigged the game. Now, I think we'll get to the truth because eventually truth will come out. But we've lost some time. And why I bring this up, in my op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a while back, what I wrote in the Wall Street Journal was I really believed that it was important that we do a moratorium on gain-of-function research. We shouldn't be doing research to try to make pathogens more pathogenic for humans right now. We should not just let a group of scientists make that decision. We should have that broader debate with society. And if society decides we need to do the research because it has potential value for the human condition.
What do you think you could give just like a quick 101 on the gain of function research and what the best case scenario is for conducting that research?
Well, the argument came back, and I was very much involved in this. 2012, 2014, there was a group of scientists that had figured out how you had to change bird flu. Bird flu right now can really cause a lot of disease in birds and kill birds and be a problem for birds, or be a problem potentially if it evolved to humans. But it hasn't learned how to go human to human.
I see.
It's just in birds, right? So, but when it learns how to go human to human, we're going to have a pandemic. We're going to have a big problem. Okay. And, for your readers, if they want to get a sense of the magnitude of this, read John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, and it'll give you a sense of why I'm concerned. Okay.
Yeah.
And so the scientists from Europe had figured this out. Netherlands had figured this out. And it was a certain number of amino acids that had to be changed. And if you change those amino acids, this non-pathogenic bird flu for humans became highly pathogenic for humans. So I could go from a bird flu that if you couldn't get sick or it wouldn't even infect you, now by making this simple change, I could make it so I could kill 5 to 25% of people. Now, the scientists that did this wanted to publish it. I argued, and this is where Fauci, I think, made a big mistake. Fauci became a big advocate, wrote something in the Washington Post and other things about how important it is that we, do this research and we publish it. I argued from my military background that we should not publish the research because I thought there were some non-state sponsored terrorists that may take this information and cause us a big problem, because it's not very difficult for me to take bird flu and convert it now that I know how to change it to a pathogen that could kill literally millions of people.
Does this get into that dual use conundrum?
Could be dual use. It could be dual use, but it could also just be bioterrorism. Let's just say, it's harder to steal planes now and do other things that, and dirty bombs. It's pretty simple for me to get bird flu and make a few changes in my kitchen, and I have a pathogen now that can basically kill millions of people.
That is just astonishing.
And I felt that this should not be published. People from NIH and other scientists argued it had to be published because it's science. Right? That was 2012, 2014. It was published. The American journal decided not to publish it, but the European journals published it. I felt, I do believe this, and I do believe in God. I think it's a miracle that hasn't been used to harm the global population yet. Right? But that research then is taking a pathogen that is not pathogenic necessarily, changing either the infectivity or the pathogenicity of the organism for humans. Now, people like Tony and others will argue you need to do it because we need to know how these pathogens change so that we can anticipate their change so we can develop the countermeasures. So, their intent is good. I just think it's misguided. And that's the work that was being done here. This laboratory in Wuhan was trying to learn how they could take bat coronaviruses which could not infect humans, and changed them so they could infect humans. And so what they did was they even published in 2014 that they succeeded. They took a bat coronavirus, used humanized mice, so they had the human ACE2 receptor, and they showed that they finally got this virus that couldn't infect humans to infect human tissue. That was all published in 2014.
Mm.
So now you have to wonder, could that have anything to do with the fact in 2018 we have now a pathogen in that same region that's now infecting humans? So highly likely that this was a consequence of that research. Again, the intent of the research was, I think, to try to prepare to protect the world from when nature evolved this. But the scientific arrogance that they had was they never believed the possibility that the experiments themselves may have led to a virus that then could escape and cause the exact problem that they were trying to prevent. When SARS came into the human species in 2003, came from a bat to a civet cat into humans. That first SARS outbreak basically infected less than 1,000 people in the world. And then it died out. To date, 18, 19 years later, less than 10,000 cases in the world. Why? Because SARS never learned how to go human to human, right? It didn't know how to go human to human in an efficient way. When MERS came in 2012, 13, it went from a bat to a camel, and it also infected less than 1,000 humans. And it's also now infected less than 10,000 humans, basically 9 years later. Why? It never learned how to go human to human. COVID was first observed, and it was infecting hundreds of thousands of people. How did this, when Tony says it's just like SARS and MERS, it's not just like SARS and MERS. They never learned how to go human to human, even in 10 years, even in 20 and 18 years. COVID immediately understood how to go human to human. And people like me say that's not surprising because the lab in 2014 published a paper that they taught the bat coronavirus how to go human to human. I mean, how to go infect the human tissue through the ACE2 receptor. And what I tell people who keep saying this virus probably came from nature, and this upsets me that people aren't being scientifically objective. If you look at the current COVID-19 virus, which has infected millions of people worldwide almost immediately, you take that virus that now supposedly came from bats and went into some animal into the humans, rather than my hypothesis, it went from a bat into a laboratory and was taught how to infect humans. That virus no longer can infect bats. How does a virus no longer infect bats? Well, because it was changed to infect humans.
What are some of the emerging bioinformatics technologies that you could share with our audience? Like CRISPR comes to mind. Is it becoming increasingly possible to simply like program bio weapons with computers?
Well, a couple things. I think clearly a lot of this technology, CRISPR and other technology, gene editing technologies, have enormous promise therapeutically, right, for different diseases. But it's like anything else. There's a double-edged sword.
Right.
People may think sequencing all our genetic codes and 22andMe and everything is just it's totally benign. But there is something about the security of our genetic information, because it is, it's like anything. You can find strengths and you can find potential weaknesses in genetic information. And those genetic information weaknesses could theoretically be exploited. This is what different people think. And even though I don't think that way as a physician, I think about the therapeutic way that we're going to learn this. I think you have to be open-minded that information could be used in different directions.
Mm.
They could be used in different directions. And, when I look at the coronavirus, and some of my concerns about the coronavirus is it has a 12 nucleotide sequence in it that it's no longer classified, so I can say it,
I
that
see.
codes for a furin cleavage site. And it's interesting, contrary to what some people try to spin and say some coronaviruses have furin cleavage sites, none of the coronaviruses in the family of this coronavirus have a furin cleavage site, right? None of them.
I'm unfamiliar with that term. Could you just describe what that means? A fear and cleavage
Well,
site?
furin, it's just it's where a protease happens to go to split a protein. Okay, so
Hmm.
and so when viruses are assembled, so when the coronavirus without that cleavage site gets the binding site for its receptor, if this is the human receptor, the H2 receptor, the bat receptor might look like this, and so the virus without it will bind the bat receptor
I
like this.
see. I see.
So now you have the human receptor, it looks like this, it doesn't bind. But when you put a furin cleavage site into that, it converts this so it goes in like this. So now it binds to the human receptor, which naturally it wouldn't do. Now it's interesting, those 12 nucleotides end up coding for 4 different amino acids. One of the amino acids it codes for is called arginine. On 2 of them, actually, the arginines. Arginine has different 3-letter sequences that code for arginine. And there's certain 3-letter sequences that bat uses, and there's certain 3-letter sequences that human use. This cleavage site somehow uses the arginine sequence that humans use.
Mm.
So why would the bat virus put an arginine sequence in there that humans use? And this is, I think, why a lot of thoughtful pathogenic virologists say this is not natural.
Mm.
This was engineered.
Wow.
All right. And I think you'll see more of that. And it upsets me that other really good scientists are dismissive of this. They won't even allow an honest debate about it. They'll present this information, say, well, other coronaviruses have cleavage sites, furin cleavage sites, so it's not important. And so the American public doesn't understand. Yeah, that's true, but they're not anywhere near the family of these coronaviruses. They're the cold viruses way over here. They're not in this family. This is so unique. So, it's declassified now. Everybody knows that it has a furin cleavage site, but the people that don't want to acknowledge its relevance say, well, yeah, but other viruses have it too. Well, no, not coronaviruses in this family. This is unique. And by the way, they used a sequence for arginine that is not from bats, it's from humans. Oh, and by the way, this virus no longer can infect bats. You tell me an evolutionary virus that evolves from an animal and within a year can no longer infect its prime host. Doesn't happen.
Well, I'm not an expert in this field, but that conjecture does make sense, or it does beg that question. Well, Dr. Redfield, you've been very generous with your time. I'd like to ask a couple of wrap-up questions here. So obviously, you've got an extensive national security career, and so what advice would you give to a young person who is, stepping into the kind of roles that you had as a young Army lieutenant or captain, I guess back in the 70s, perhaps? And what are the kinds of things that you think that they'll be encountering, and what kind of advice would you give to that person?
I think the first thing I would say is be careful of people who try to create narratives.
Hmm.
You have your own brain, use it. Think it through. Be very cautious when people are trying to create a narrative and sell you a narrative. I think I've always, for better or worse, um, been viewed as counterintuitive. Maybe that's the gift that I got, that I didn't buy into the status quo. I think it's so important to question in a non-emotional way, in a non-personal way. And when people try to dismiss and say, well, this is the way it is, if that doesn't make sense, say, well, wait, I don't understand.
Hmm.
Why is it that way?
Yeah.
You I don't understand why you think herd immunity is going to work when I have patients that have had COVID and in 5 months they get COVID again.
Hmm.
So if natural immunity doesn't protect them, why do I think vaccine immunity is going to protect them, or why do I think that we'll get herd immunity? Won't we just get a bunch of people that go from susceptible to non-susceptible to susceptible to non-susceptible?
Hmm.
Herd
Hmm.
immunity means you go from susceptible to non-susceptible and you stay non-susceptible.
I see. So it sounds like you would tell a young Army lieutenant or captain who's entering the field of virology, think for yourself and don't be afraid to say, I don't know, if you actually don't know.
I don't know, or I don't understand, or can you explain that to me? And then to ask a question. I think it's so important. You know, I know in my early career, I got involved because I got involved in trying to figure out this new epidemic we had back in '81 called AIDS.
Mm,
And, everyone kind of said that, it's only going to be transmitted among gay men and drug addicts. But my patients at Walter Reed, 30 over 30% of my patients were women.
mm,
And when I looked at husbands and wives that had one of them had AIDS, I found out that half the time their partner was infected. And I said, I think this is a sexually transmitted disease. And everyone would say, well, no, that can't be. It can't be sexually transmitted disease. It's a gay disease.
mm.
So I encourage people to think for themselves, to be very careful about people that are trying to create a narrative. Um, you know, uh, their insights, a young person's insight, may ultimately be the insight that the nation and the world needs, and
Mm.
have confidence in that. Um, you
Yeah.
know, I'd encourage, what I would like to do, and part of the reasons we had this conversation is to try to escalate people's awareness that this conversation is not just a social exercise, that we are at high risk for a devastating pandemic. We do have the opportunity to prepare for that in a meaningful way that we can substantially minimize its impact on our way of life. But in order for us to do that, it's going to require an enormous effort. And I'm just hoping there's enough leaders that reflect on this, that over the next decade will help build that structure for when that great pandemic comes, that we'll be able to minimize its impact on our nation and the world.
Right. Right. And lastly, I'd like to know, yeah, what is it that you've been doing since you departed the CDC in 2021?
Well, thank you. A few things. Governor Hogan asked me to be a senior public health advisor for the state of Maryland, so I've helped him. He'll be finishing his term in January, so that will come to an end. But I've enjoyed being involved in trying to maximize Maryland's public health response to COVID and other diseases. I've been able to form a consulting group and had the privilege to work with like AMLLC and several other groups, particularly that are involved in trying to improve our public health of our nation. or groups that are developing countermeasures, either antivirals, diagnostics, or vaccines. I have a big commitment to vaccines. I believe they're the most important gift of science to modern medicine. I'm disappointed that most of the world still doesn't get access to vaccines, and COVID was a good example of it. We have a very good model for giving vaccines to children under the age of 5, where we have a nonprofit model, and we have UNICEF and other groups that avian and others get pediatric vaccines to kids around the world. But there really is no model to provide vaccines to the broader population. So when COVID hit, we needed vaccines for adults. There is no model. And so what you have is the current nonprofit model just is not scalable, it's not sustainable, and these individuals just don't get access. So I started a company whose goal it is to build a business model that is a for-profit model, not large profits, but the reason it's for profit is because the nonprofit model is not scalable and it's not sustainable. So I'm trying to build a scalable and sustainable model to get vaccines around the world. And so I've started that. I'm still, if you have any angel investors that want to help me get to the next level, but I am building a company now to try to get
Excellent.
vaccines to resource poor and moderate income countries. And a colleague of mine from Harvard, who we've worked together for 35 years in vaccines, we started a company together, PDTI, and we're committed to try to make this business model work, because if it doesn't, there will be no vaccines for a majority of the people in the world, because they're not going to be a nonprofit model that's going to give the vaccines we need for adults in a scalable and sustainable model. And we're about to have scientific success in a vaccine for malaria and scientific success in a vaccine for TB, and not me, but the scientific community and private sector at large. And those vaccines need to get to people. And the last thing that keeps me excited, and tomorrow, Thursday and Friday, I've gone back to practice medicine again. So on Thursdays and Fridays, I practice medicine, and I spent over 30 years as an AIDS doctor, and now my old patients are coming back to me, and I'm starting to see some new patients and some patients with helping them with COVID immunity and trying to figure out, do they need the vaccines, and if so, when and what. And then I'm doing long COVID, and I'm doing hepatitis B and HIV. So I'm staying busy.
I should say so, yes.
The only difference is I'm kind of in charge of my time now. And so that's really what I'm doing.
Wow, my goodness. Well, we certainly wish you and your colleagues Godspeed as you pursue those various different initiatives. And with that, Dr. Robert Redfield, thank you so much for having been a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.